Um, let's just get started rather than giving people, infinite time to filter in. They can just join in with the discussion. So we haven't had one of these in a little while. There's been a lot of travel and flying around, and a lot of people on this call were actually in various places as well. But the good news is UCAN 0.10 was merged, released. In large parts, sort of the timing of that was I was chatting with some of the folks over at Spruce who said, hey, we're basing the formats of another token recap on being compatible with this next version of UCAN. It would be really nice if that was merged. And I was like, yeah, this has been sitting here long enough. It has approvals from everyone. Let's just hit the button. So that's in. Sort of the open secret is it's expected to be the 1.0 release. We just want to actually get it implemented and try it out for a month before we actually flip that switch, because that's us committing to this is the version for the next long while that maybe we can add stuff to, but we won't remove anything from. Yeah. And then at that point, things become, the focus on the project becomes largely around quality of life features, right? So like actually taking the libraries, adding a bunch of creature comforts to them, making them easier to work with. And then all the stuff that we've been talking about for a really long time, standard library, patterns, all of that stuff, right? And kind of have a push for it. We are seeing UCAN show up in an increasing number of places. I was getting a demo the other day of a new product, and they're like, yeah, and if you open the web console, you'll notice that there's a token in there, and despite it being basics, I was like, that is a UCAN. So adoption seems to be going along. People seem to be enjoying it, finding value from it. But the hardest parts today really are, how should I hold this thing, right? When somebody signs in, in a browser or on a desktop, and I'm designing a service for it, how should that look, right? So adding a bunch of these patterns from the history of certificate capabilities, from our experience with it, from a bunch of people on this call, subconscious getting experience with it, we should write those down, put them into libraries, make them easier to use. And that's not to say that people can't use it another way, but we should, pave the cow paths, as the phrase goes. Yes, Alan.
Yeah, so we had talked the last time, which I guess was 2 months ago, about how the invocation wasn't settled yet. And it seems like unless the invocation is settled, you can't go to 1.0.
Yeah, so invocation is now actually in use in a couple systems. So we think that's settled for the next little while at least.
The spec wasn't clear, and you said it needed more work. And this is one of the write-ups that I did, was getting the invocation right. And so just want to make sure that's settled. I mean, people may be using it, but if it's not right, you certainly don't want to go to 1.0 with it.
Yeah, no, totally. It's been 2 months. I think we've actually done that, but I'll go and double check, and I'll take a look.
But the important point is that you cannot use a wildcard certificate in an invocation because it does not designate the specific resource, and that was not the case the last time I looked at the spec. You hadn't said.
So that's definitely the case. Okay. I don't know if it's spelled out in the spec, but that's definitely the case. You can't, you have to actually talk about the thing that you're using.
Right, in the certificate.
In the indication, yeah. So
in the certificate, because otherwise you could specify the thing separately in a different field.
So you should be able to delegate a wildcard in the delegations, right, but not in the indication.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Which is why they're separate specs, right? It's like they have slightly different semantics, right? Yeah. They behave slightly differently.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which was, we went back and forth a bunch of times on, should there just be an invoke true, field?
Hmm.
And there were enough changes and enough differences that breaking it out into its own spec and its own
Yes.
way of working really made sense.
Yeah, you have to. You have to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we've seen in a lot of the other specs, they just have a, this is an indication flag,
And
basically.
yeah, and that was the
Yeah,
reason for the DWN write-up.
right, right. Yeah. Yeah, one of the knock-on effects of that actually has been being able to, so the IPFS community is exploring using invocations for writing into the DHT, which is not something you'd be able to do, doing delegated rights into the DHT to say, I'm allowed to tell you what's on this particular node, even though I'm not on that node right now, right? I'm like say the controlling process or something, right? I'm the load balancer. And so that delegation and then invocation step has actually turned out to be useful even there, where I wouldn't have guessed that previously. So it's been kind of interesting seeing the sort of the different use cases people are trying with it coming out of the woodwork. So, but yeah, I'll just take a note in this here right now. Explicitly no star in invocations. And I'll just fix that right after the call. I'll just add that as a line. Awesome. Yeah, so that's the main updates from the core spec, or I guess the delegation spec. Something we could consider changing the name of that to. Actually getting it implemented, there's been some work towards this in the TypeScript library, though some of the thinking is that we'll take where most of the effort is going these days, which is Rust, compile that to WebAssembly, put a nice TypeScript shell around it. And then if somebody wants to rewrite the whole thing in TypeScript down the line, they totally can, but there's only so much, so many hours in the day. And so this seems like a good time-saving measure, basically. And it's definitely going to be compatible then because they'll actually be running the same engine. Chris, I know that your team has been doing a little bit of work over there, and I unfortunately haven't had a chance to dig too deeply into that PR. Could you give us a little update? What's how that's coming along?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we're very interested in getting UCANs on the Rust implementation side to be as close to the 1.0 spec as possible. Just for background context, my company's using UCANs pretty extensively, and we're gearing up for a major release of the product that uses UCANs, and we're hoping to not have to, we're trying to mitigate migration pains for ourselves down the road. So we're a little bit motivated to update the library to be in line with the latest and greatest spec. So we've done a lot of work recently to get RSUCAN up to date with 0.10, which for the most part has been a straightforward evolution. I think there were some, there were meaningful breaking changes, and we still haven't completely covered all of those yet. We still have vestigial support for my and as in the library as of today, and we don't have support for the UCAN colon syntax. And one meta comment I wanted to make just about the process of us going from there to where we are now. At one point, we had support for UCAN IPLD, and we actually had to remove support for it as we moved towards 0.10. And it just caused me to do a lot of thinking about, the nature of the specs and how they interrelate, and how it might be nice to have like some kind of, I don't know if maturity is the right word, but like a table of like, this is, how close in orbit to the core spec is this adjacent spec, and it's sort of like, what's its radioactivity in terms of, likeliness to change in the near future. Is it compatible with the latest core spec or not? Type of stuff like that. Just because I think if we could have updated UCAN IPLD implementation to be in line with 0.10, we would have. and it was just, in hindsight, kind of a bummer that we ended up having to drop it. Not that it wasn't worth implementing in the first place.
So Chris, sounds like you're in the position to write that document, at least for IPLD.
Well, sort of. I mean, I had no hand writing the UCAN IPLD spec. I had to do a little bit of fishing to figure out what the sort of intention was by the authors to continue updating it or not. But yeah, I think what my comment is a little bit broader about the spec, because like there's indications also that has sort of come up since the last meeting. And I know that everything is kind of gravitating towards a point of optimal stability, but we'll probably be implementing that soon too. And it'd be nice to know if that's safe to do now or if we should wait.
Awesome. Yeah, really good. Good idea with the maturity table, I guess, or the compatibility table even.
Yeah, the way TC39 has different stages for specs. I mean, that might be a little heavy-handed as a process at this point. But.
Yeah, but you're right that the sort of the push here is to get to stable specs sort of sooner rather than later. Because always have to go back in and have breaking changes or a compatibility layer just kind of sucks. And at this point, the changes between specs, at least the intention has been that they're not like massive revamps, right? It's like, okay, this is probably good enough for most people's uses. I can't imagine a ton of different changes that we would need to make to elaborate to like support use cases. So like, let's just say that this is the version that we're going to support for a while. And for all of the things that you're talking about, right? IPLD, invocations, sort of, et cetera. Yeah, but definitely good feedback, especially the IPLD. We've known that probably needed an update for a little bit, but just hasn't risen in the priority stack. So maybe it needs to go higher on the priorities.
Yeah, and I mean, I understand a lot of these things come about because there's a small number of folks who have a vested interest in their existence, and it can be hard to sort of get everybody's schedules to line up just so. So totally appreciated that it'll take a while for IPLD to update.
Yeah. Awesome. So those are the main things on the initial agenda. Alan would like to talk a little bit about DWN, but prior to that, does anybody else have stuff that they'd like to add to the agenda today?
I don't know that it's an agenda item necessarily, but as for the RSUCAN implementation for 0.10, do we have any sort of tracking on the status of that? I know there's a PR. Does that PR cover all of it? What else is there to do?
Yeah, so the PR that's currently up there right now gets us structurally in line with 0.10, but it omits implementation of some new syntax within the capabilities themselves. We've got I believe the current status is we're filing an issue to cover that territory, but once that's implemented, we should be 0.10 compatible. We unfortunately lack for any kind of conformance test suite other than our own test suite. So if anybody on the Fission or the spec authoring side has the time, it would be wonderful to get maybe a spot check or something on the current implementation to see if we missed anything. But yeah. I think we are very close to full compatibility with 0.10.
Awesome.
To the best of my reading.
Yeah, if we can get those issues written, that's exactly where the question is coming from. Is at least from the Fission side, like what
issue. The feedback I left on the PR yesterday was let's file the issue. I didn't check today to see if it was filed yet.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll look right now. Yeah, the issue hasn't been filed yet, but we'll get it filed today.
Okay. I would love to add something to the agenda, the minor thing. So in UCAN, Cacao, whatever capabilities related world, I noticed that we basically craft custom code to verify capabilities and to find what capabilities are allowed for each resources. So I would like to run weird micro language by you on how to describe that and maybe generate some code from that kind of capability.
Okay, yeah.
Description language. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, for sure. All right, that's on the agenda. It's like a capabilities DSL kind of thing. Awesome. Anyone else? We go over to Alan. All right, Alan, take it away.
Yeah, so I've been doing on the DWN calls what I do here, which is lurk and then pop up when you're trying to make a mistake that I made in the past. So there were two major issues that came up. One was invocation, and the second one was revocation. And so I put in links in the chat to the two write-ups I did for the DWN people. Just to summarize, when you do an invocation, and we have to be careful here on the use cases for the invocation, because a single argument use case is not going to capture all the pitfalls that you can end up falling into, foot guns that are there. So it's important to consider a three argument kind of thing. One argument is the resource you're using. The second one is a second parameter that may be used. So for example, copy this resource over to here. And so you have read permission on one and write permission on another one. But then it's also important to include a case where you get a return value. And in fact, this is one that's a real problem for DWN. Apparently their nodes can't sign anything. And so they don't have a good way to do a return value, but UCAN does. And so you want to have that. And this was the example I used in the transitive access paper that showed how horrible things can happen if you try to use an ACL-based solution for a simple three-party case. And so in the invocation, the important thing is that you designate the resource you're invoking with the capability itself, with the certificate itself, that other arguments are delegated to that resources server, so that all secondary arguments have to be delegated. So think of it as an object-oriented program. You say foo.method of bar, comma, quux. If those are object references, well, foo is the capability to invoke methods on the object. And by providing object references to the other two arguments, you're effectively delegating to that service. And so that's how the service can satisfy my request, even though it doesn't control all the resources in the arguments. So for example, in the copy case, very simple copy case, I could say foo.copy a bar, and bars is owned by a third-party resource server. And then it can get that from that party from the delegated capability. So I want to make sure that those things are called out clearly in the invocation spec. And that the use case, that you use a more complicated use case than I've seen so far. So that's the bit on invocation.
So just to repeat that back to make sure that I'm following the whole thing. So I'm a service. I don't have access to. I'm not the one actually say storing some bit of data. It's in a database that's in another service.
Right.
I get an invocation that says, "Hey, I want you to read data from that database, perform some transformation to it, and I don't know, send an email with that." Right? In the
Actually, rather than send an email, store it over here in this third service.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to sort of pipe through.
That's right.
It's sort of like the classic. I'll almost like right simplification stuff with the, can opener and the can sort of thing, right?
Well,
Saying,
this isn't exactly that, because that applies to a single resource, but
right. But you're
So-
saying basically, like in my proof chain, I can say I have access to this database and I have access to that database.
Mhm.
I have read access over here, write access over there. They tell me, hey, I want you to do this copy.
Yep.
And then I can basically pop off the invocation, create a new invocation to each side of that and kind of do that piping in the middle. Yep.
exactly.
That's
So the example I used was Bob runs Alice wants to use Bob's backup service, and Bob's backup service uses Carol's copy service.
Mhm.
Okay, and that was the simplest example I could come up with that captured all the hazards I was aware of.
Mhm.
And there are many ways to do that wrong. So that's why I think it's a good use case to consider.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
But basically, that's it. That's why you have to delegate the parameters to the service when you do an invocation, so it can use those resources with your permissions.
And when you say parameters, so UCAN lets you essentially, as long as you keep scoping it further and further down, you can keep getting narrower and narrower. And then the invocation has to just be able to show that it's some subset of those, right? By parameters, do you mean like the arguments that you would pass in the invocation?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
yeah,
the
okay.
API parameters, and those have to be specific resources, not
Mhm.
collections, unless the operation is on a collection, like, list a directory. But typically, it's the specific resource that the service you're invoking will have to act on.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So something that we've run into, especially with promise pipelining, things like that, I'd love to get your take, is you don't always know the specific resource that you're going to get back from a particular step. So you might say, like, I'm going to work on something that's in this directory, and I'm going to find out which file it is when I make this call to this database over here. And I don't want that to come all the way back to me and then make a separate request, but I'm going to scope down what that second request is allowed to do to the minimal surface area, but it's wider than the single resource. It's like, I could do something with this directory as opposed to like this file, because I don't know what file it is yet. Does that match your picture, or am I missing stuff in there?
No, and I have to think about that that use case some more. Typically, let's see. Yeah, so I can delegate to the service I invoke a collection. Let's call it a wildcard. It will do an invocation and get back, then learn the specific thing I wanted it to work on. And then it would create the specific capability to work on that one item. Now, this is actually a violation of least privilege, because I'm giving that service, everything covered by the wildcard when it only needs the one. But I think that may be the best you can do. So, but I'll have to think about that case a little bit more.
Yeah, that was the conclusion we came to as well, that because there's a lack of information when you go to actually make this invocation, you should scope it as close as you can, but a malicious agent could return like, oh no, it's not this record, it's that other record instead, right? So
yeah. So the better approach might be not to go back to you with the resource and then forward it, but just go back to you with the designation, and then you do a second call to provide the specific resource rather than providing a wildcard in the first place. That would be safer. That would better enforce least privilege. It would be an extra pair of messages, but it wouldn't be a lot of data. So, but again, I have to walk through it in detail. Anyway, so that's the invocation, and I just brought up the invocation spec, and at the introduction, it doesn't look like you've captured it quite correctly, but I'd have to go through and see the details. I haven't gotten there yet. So that's the invocation part. And then the document on revocation is, there's just a lot of different ways to do it and a lot of different policies you can apply. And sometimes picking one precludes another. And so you're just going to have to make an architectural decision. Some of them you can, some things you can just leave to policy. So in revocation, the key thing is the verifier. When a request comes in, there's something that verifies if this capability matches this request. And the verifier is the one that can enforce policy. So in a delegation, so the most important thing about delegation, and I'm not sure, but it looks like the DWN people didn't get this right. The most important thing about revocation is that you prove you have permission to revoke. And there are different ways to do that. One way is to revoke a specific permission. And so I can give you access to a capability, and that the scope can include revocation or not. That's one way to do it. And then when you delegate, you can make the same choice down the chain. Another choice is anybody holding a capability can revoke it. Okay. And then when there's a delegation chain, it could be that you can only revoke your direct delegations, or you can revoke any delegation farther down the chain. And these are all policy decisions and options that need to be considered. And typically in the documents I've been looking at, the revocation section is so short that I know it doesn't cover those things.
Yeah. So the one that we've opted for in the spec, but I agree that I have a old to-do item to break out revocation to its own spec and just like really expand that out. Is the one, as long as you're in the proof chain, then you can revoke anything down the line by its hash.
Okay, there's another issue here with shortening. I don't remember if DWN does shortening by taking a long delegation chain and making replacing some piece of it with a proof. When you do that, you can't delegate in the middle of it because you don't have the certificates. So that's another issue, and I don't know if UCAN does the shortening, but there are other systems that do.
Yeah, so we haven't thought about shortening in that way yet. The two cases that we've seen is if you're going to do a lot of back and forth with the server, like just literally two parties, taking that UCAN and basically exchanging it for a shorter bearer token, so that you don't have to pass the whole thing around. And that token, what we've seen in practice is people will use the content ID or the hash of the token to be like, yep, it's me again, right? The other one that we've thought about, but it's a little bit further out, I think possible to do today, but it's a little further out, is to use something like a snark to do the
that was the shortening, but now you can't revoke the middle of the snark.
So we thought about it a little bit. One of the things you can do in this version is the output of the snark can also include the hashes of all of the things that are inside of the snark.
Well, you have to, the snark itself can't do that. You need some additional metadata to allow that.
So the snark will give you a proof that its outputs are correct for the snark. So we would have to come up with like a really solid snark that part of its outputs, like all it's doing is aggregating hashes together. Basically, it's like it does the check that all the delegations are correct. And then as part of its output, it'll say these are all the hashes of the ones that I've looked at. And because that's now on the outside, all those hashes are on the outside, you have a list of them, and you can say like, yep, this one and this one and this one.
Yeah, I haven't thought about how to do it, but I know that if you're going to shorten, you're going to have to worry about that, or just give up revoking the middle of those chains. You can just revoke the things that are outside the chain. So anyway, so those are the main points, and the write-up gives some examples and illustrations. So using the capability as the argument is like using a file handle to do a read. And just to try to tie it back to things more people are more familiar with.
Totally, yeah, it's a good point, and I completely agree about revocation needing a larger section. It's been one of the things that we like, despite it being in the spec for like quite some time, people just like their eyes just slide over it and they just don't see that section. So it needs to be its own like full
That's
thing.
why I'm on this call.
Yeah,
Because
thank
I
you.
know that happens.
Other stuff from DWN.
They're going ahead and making a lot of progress and doing all kinds of things that are outside my area of expertise. So, like I said, I just my ears perk up when I hear anything about capabilities. So,
amazing. All right, Sergey.
Okay, that was quick. So, if you don't mind, could you please let me share my screen? Okay.
Oh yeah, I don't actually have that. I'm no longer the host of this actually.
Oh.
Or is it because I'm not signed in? Maybe. Let me see. I'll try this. Well, that's not great.
All right.
James, you know who has such rights these days?
I believe there's a Fission account Zoom. The quick answer is no, I have no idea.
We decided to move this out of my personal account to something where, if I'm sick or on vacation or something, it doesn't have to be me, but this is unfortunately the downside of that. If we need to, I can just spin up a room or one of us can spin up a room and we can just hop over there if that's better.
I can do it a different way. So I posted a link here in the Zoom chat. Please scroll down to a line starting with, for example, W and FS. Oh my God. To that line. So a bit of backstory. We have UCANs, we have cacaos that are quite similar now, or are going to be quite similar to UCANs with a format of everything. And one thing that I have noticed is that we basically hard code our checking logic and capability creation logic all over the place. And by crafting, hand crafting, I mean that developer goes and looks like, all right, here is that resource that is allowed, that could do this set of actions on it. And like, the best thing one can do is some Notion doc or text documentation, but it's like suboptimal because most of the time it has to be automated in some way. So like I wrote a little, not really language, is just a very rough draft of how maybe it should look like. I read through all the languages for policy management across the space, like Rego, Cedar, Polar from OISO, and apparently, it's a bit trickier to do stuff with capabilities. It looks like The major difference between what we do with capabilities and how policy language try to do stuff is that for policy languages, you most of the time cannot define, like, if you have rights to update a certain folder, you could update anything inside it. So, well, maybe we could do something like that description to use as the ultimate source of truth with regards to how capabilities could be merged, expanded, or verified. Like, you load a file into WNFS library or code, and then it does all the checks automatically, maybe without checking all the roots, without specifying all the roots. Yeah, that was clunky, but the main question for me is, like, do we really care about that stuff, or are we all right with handcrafting code for making and verifying capabilities and UCANs?
Yeah, I'd love to get other people's opinions as well. What I've seen is, at minimum, in libraries, we end up building little DSLs to do this kind of thing, sort of ad hoc anyway. Like, I think there's a desire to do this rather than having it all be in, like, lower level code, right? So it seems, at least intuitively to me, it seems like a good idea. And I think, actually, like, one of the other benefits you get out of this is you could have almost like a GraphQL description language, right? That you could say, hey, what are the things that you accept? And you could just, like, get a list and be like, oh, this is what your interface is. I know Stephen and Blaine, who are on the call, have thought about that a little bit, which is definitely in this direction. Chris?
I just wanted to express general support for the idea, not maybe any specific implementation, but we've often looked at our imperative code that sort of defines how UCAN should be structured and thought, no, this needs to be consolidated to the point where we'd like something like a protobuf descriptor or something for it, and then maybe just like have them generated for us, and then that way it's a little bit easier for us to read what we're doing and see everything in one place.
Alan?
Yeah, this is just the API. So how do we know what any arbitrary web service does? We look up its API and it's got some approach for doing the invocation. So isn't that just reducing to the same problem?
Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, if I have some web
Example,
service I
maybe?
want to use, it's got a published API. And then I use that published API to code up my use of that service. Now, there's many ways to do it. I think you're saying today we're doing it by writing custom code for every invocation. And you're proposing something like, an IDL that will be simpler than writing the code, but will cover all the APIs that we might encounter. Is that what I'm hearing?
Kind of. If my understanding is correct, which might be not true, what you're talking is closer to, say, Open API / Swagger approach. And here I'm mostly worried about the same stuff, the same, say, philosophical approach to capability attenuations. Like,
well, I don't think that, from what I saw on the web page that you linked to, you wouldn't put the user in the invocation, you'd put the capability, but that's a side issue. I think your main point is that you're saying that today, to do that invocation, I would have to write code. And you're looking for some specification that will generate the code. Is that what you're
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And that's independent of whether it's capabilities or ACLs or anything else, I think. So that's why I'm saying, aren't there other approaches that do that in existing systems that if it's important, we could just copy.
Well, you could generate code for an API based on Open API, but yeah, but like there is no way you could let's say deduce that the user is allowed to read something.
Oh, yeah. No, we'd have to adapt it. I'm not saying we could use exactly
Well,
this, but that's the idea. That's what
yeah, that's the idea. I have looked through lots of spaces,
Okay.
lots of specifications and languages, and I found nothing remotely useful.
Yes, for capabilities, I agree.
That's really good to know, because that's what I was about to ask you right after, if there was an existing something.
But adapting them is not hard, I don't think, because instead of the argument, like many of them will take a string to designate what resource, your adaptation would just take the capability in that place. So you can't use the existing systems, but I think you can adapt them with modest effort. I don't know.
Yep, more or less. More or less. I mean, you could definitely use something like Polar if you squint a lot at it.
Yeah, that's the modest effort part. This is the squinting. And it depends on the framework you're using too, how hard it is to adapt. Some of them are quite rigid, I believe, and others give you a lot of freedom.
Yeah, but the little differences accumulate.
But for what it's worth, I think that you'll probably mainly hear my gut intuition is you'll mainly hear support for such an idea, right? Like, let's have a higher level declarative description, right? That's you can both query and that you could then use to generate UCANs or checking and all of this stuff. Higher level DSL is usually a good thing. If somebody doesn't want to use it, they don't have to, right? But it's a helpful tool.
I'm actually a write your own code kind of guy. I find the tools both too hard to learn and too limited. But that's just me.
But great, because then you can still write your own custom versions of all of this stuff because it's at a different layer. So
Yeah.
should still work. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's a decent idea. And I don't write million lines of code applications, but people who do probably need those kinds of things.
What would the next steps be for such a project? Do you are you proposing like the specific syntax? Do you want people to look at this document? Should we start a discussion in the repo?
Well, I think the immediate next thing is, well, to see if the syntax would be all right to cover a few cases, like real world cases, and like say my brain could reason through that. I guess the next part, again, silent one, would be to post something. I'm not sure, to UCAN working group or whatever, with the code that would well, simplify working with the ceramic capabilities first, and then we'll see how it would be going for larger UCAN / capabilities ecosystem.
Yeah, that definitely sounds very reasonable. If so, I've added a link to the doc you shared into the notes. If there end up being further, discussions, PRs over in the ceramic world, feel free to drop those in there as well. I'd love to sort of keep track of it as it develops.
just from a capability perspective, owner has a big part to play in this example, and of course, that's not a capability way of thinking about it. So,
could you elaborate more?
the owner isn't anybody special. The owner, if I create an object, I get back a capability to use it. That's it. And when I use it, I can delegate to myself or the program running on my behalf. If I just want to read, I'll just delegate a read permission. So owner isn't special in the capability world. In the Apple world, the owner is necessary because that's the only way to give others permissions. But in the capability world, it's not.
Yeah, so maybe some context on this specific example. I think he's using an example that especially the Fission folks would be familiar with, which is the file system we've written, and it's Merkleized. So you need to be able to look up what the latest root hash of that structure is, and we do that by taking the owner's name and looking it up in DNS.
Ah, okay, yeah. So that's just an index. It's not a permission in any sort. Okay.
Yeah, it's a way of pointing at that particular file system as opposed to somebody else's.
Yeah, I would use another word.
Code.
Yeah, I would use a word other than owner because that will confuse Apple people, as it confused me. So maybe root hash or pre-root or something like that rather than owner.
Or name.
Something, yeah. Some just not owner.
Okay. That's owner is kind of all through the file systems docs. Okay. So that's probably on us more than on.
All right. Yeah. Well, I got confused. So.
It's good feedback. All right. Anything else people want to discuss, or should we all take 10 minutes?
Just a question. As I'm reading through the invocation spec, just go to the issues, create an issue if I find something, or add to an existing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Anything else people want to chat about this month? I mean, we're also always around in the GitHub issues discussions and on Discord. So it's not like this is your last possible chance, but last possible chance for a live discussion.
You know, I don't think I'm on that Discord. I need an invitation.
Yeah, here, let me get you an invite. I think this never.
You can just email it to me.
Yeah, here. I can just drop it. It's an open Discord, so I'll just drop it in the chat. There you go.
Okay. It's somewhere where I won't lose it.
Yeah, maybe we should. It might be in the GitHub like organization README, but we should double check that that's on there as well. I'll just take a quick note to make sure, because we definitely want people to be able to drop in. It is, oh yeah, Discord server. Yeah, it is on there, so that's good. It might be good to break that out into a section that will make it a little bit more salient. Okay. Awesome. Anything else people would like to discuss? All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for coming this month. For everyone's hard work on RSUCAN, on description languages, all this stuff. It all sounds really positive. All this stuff's moving forward. Somebody on the Fission team who joined recently has had a bunch of ideas on libraries and tooling and sort of like those developer experience side of things. So we're going to have him write those up as well and see how what ranks highest for people. After we get to, as I mentioned off the top of the call, as we get to the 1.0, a lot of the effort will probably shift into how to make this stuff easier to use. So things like description languages, etc. So hopefully we'll get that out relatively soon for people to take a look at. And aside from that, we'll see you all in a month.